I used to think the greatest pain of my life was standing alone at my brother's casket, reading his eulogy for our broken family. I was wrong. The real nightmare began 2 days after the funeral. When my boyfriend said attending was too depressing, he accidentally left a trail proving he stood entirely too close to the truth behind the fatal accident. From that moment, I did not scream or beg. I simply started keeping records. My name is Isla Mitchell, and I'm 33 years old. I live in Cincinnati, a city that perfectly mirrors my own internal rhythm, pragmatic, grounded, and largely unconcerned with the flashy reinventions of the coasts. I work as a contract compliance specialist at a firm called Hawthorne Facilities Review. My entire professional existence, and arguably my personal one as well, revolves around the quiet hunt for discrepancies. I spend my days buried in mountains of paperwork, searching for the hidden gaps between what corporations promise in ink and what they actually deliver in practice. I am a woman who lives strictly by the rules. I find an immense, grounding comfort in the rigid structure of a well-drafted legal document, the indisputable truth of a clean spreadsheet, and the deep satisfaction of a perfectly organized archive. I do not do well with ambiguity. I am accustomed to resolving anomalies with hard evidence, meticulously filed records, and an unshakable calmness that others often mistake for coldness. My life has been constructed with the careful, deliberate precision of a mason laying bricks every single morning. I brew my coffee at exactly 6:15. My schedule is a masterclass in predictability, leaving zero room for sudden surprises. I keep my social circle incredibly small, trusting only a handful of people with the reality of who I am outside the office. But beneath that heavily guarded exterior, my devotion to my family runs deeper than the Ohio River. They are the only exception to my rules. Then there was my brother. Nolan Mitchell was 29 years old, but his spirit possessed an ageless, boundless kind of warmth that I could never hope to replicate. He worked as the site safety supervisor for a massive, high-stakes renovation project downtown known as the Halcyon Lofts. If I was the heavy iron anchor of the Mitchell family, Nolan was the sail, catching every breeze. We were total and complete opposites, where I was reserved and fiercely private. He was outrageously social, where I required a carefully detailed itinerary for everything. He thrived entirely on the beautiful, messy chaos of the present moment. Nolan was the kind of man who never walked into a crowded room without walking out with a new friend. He was fundamentally, undeniably good. People did not just like my brother, they remembered him. He was the guy who once drove an uninsured, severely injured drywaller to the emergency room in the passenger seat of his own battered sedan, ruining his upholstery with blood, and then sat in the waiting room until 3 a.m. just to make sure the man was not alone. He was the neighbor who spent a freezing Sunday afternoon covered in dust, fixing a broken fire alarm system for the elderly woman in apartment 4B, absolutely refusing to take a single dollar for his labor. He simply showed up when the world needed him to. He led with his heart, leaving a trail of quiet miracles behind him. Our bond was the one chaotic element I willingly and joyfully allowed into my perfectly structured life. Every single Wednesday night, without fail, my apartment intercom would buzz at exactly 7:30. It was always Nolan, his heavy arms full of greasy paper bags smelling of whatever random takeout he had fixated on that week, spicy Szechuan noodles, loaded street tacos, or overly sweet barbecue ribs. He would burst into my quiet, sterile apartment, bringing the loud noise and the gritty dirt of the construction site in with him. He would drop his heavy steel-toed work boots by the door, sprawl out on my pristine beige sofa, and fill the silent room with his stories. He talked endlessly about the eccentricities of the electrical crew, the impossible deadlines set by the wealthy developers, and the stubborn pride he took in making sure his guys went home whole every single night. Those Wednesday nights were the brightest, warmest spots in my week. He made my quiet, regimented life feel vibrant and alive. Into this tightly woven, fiercely protected family dynamic stepped Grant Holloway. Grant was 35 years old, serving as a senior director of crisis communications at a high-profile, aggressively modern firm called Vesper Lane Strategies. On paper, and certainly in person, Grant was the exact definition of stability. He was the man everyone assumed a quiet, organized woman like me was destined to marry. He was relentlessly polite, his suits were immaculately tailored to the millimeter, and his punctuality rivaled my own. Grant had a terrifyingly smooth way of moving through the world. He was an absolute master of the spoken word. If a dinner party conversation grew uncomfortably heated regarding politics or religion, Grant knew the precise combination of syllables required to completely de-escalate the tension and soothe the room back to a state of calm. He possessed a polished, frictionless charm that made him universally agreeable. My mother adored his impeccable manners. My father deeply respected his firm handshake and his highly lucrative career, but Nolan saw something else. Nolan, who judged a man entirely by how he treated the helpless and how he behaved when the audience was gone, never warmed up to Grant. He was polite to him, of course, because my brother was fundamentally incapable of cruelty, but the usual brilliant, welcoming light in Nolan's eyes always dimmed the second Grant entered the room. I noticed the shift in his energy, but I actively chose to brush it off. I told myself it was just the classic, predictable trope of the protective younger brother, refusing to believe any man was quite good enough for his older sister. I remember the exact moment the seed of unease was planted, though I stubbornly refused to water it at the time. It was a humid Friday evening in late July, just after a loud, chaotic family dinner at my parents' house. Grant had excused himself from the table with a perfectly apologetic smile to take an urgent work call on the back patio. Nolan helped me carry the heavy ceramic plates into the kitchen. He stood beside the sink, scraping uneaten roast beef into the garbage disposal, his broad shoulders unusually tense beneath his flannel shirt. I asked him, point blank, why he could not just give Grant a fair, honest chance. Nolan stopped what he was doing. He turned to me, wiping his large, calloused hands on a damp kitchen towel, and looked at me with a heavy seriousness that instantly unsettled my stomach. He leaned in close and kept his voice low, so the sound would not carry through the open window to where Grant was pacing outside. He told me that Grant was the kind of person who never says a single sentence without calculating its exact effect first. He said there was no actual blood in Grant's words, only strategy and public relations. I sighed loudly, drawing a wineglass with perhaps a bit too much aggressive force, and told Nolan he was being wildly cynical. I defended the man who shared my bed, arguing passionately that Grant's specific profession naturally required a certain level of measured diplomacy and careful phrasing. I dismissed my brother's raw instinct. I consciously chose the comfortable, seamless illusion of my perfectly curated relationship over the raw, unpolished truth of my brother's intuition. I told myself Nolan simply did not understand the corporate world, that he was far too emotionally driven to appreciate a man who operated strictly on logic and narrative control. I ignored the warning. I let the heavy moment pass, burying it quickly under the mundane details of washing dishes and discussing our upcoming Wednesday dinner plans. I had no possible way of knowing that quiet, urgent observation over the kitchen sink would be one of the very last pieces of character analysis my brother would ever share with me. The memory of his voice, steady and certain over the low hum of the refrigerator, would soon become a ghost that haunted the meticulous, organized filing cabinets of my mind, echoing endlessly in the dark days that were rapidly approaching. It was a Tuesday night, raining with such violent force that the drops sounded like loose gravel being thrown against the glass of my living room window. The time was exactly 11:14 in the evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island, fueled by black coffee, meticulously reviewing page 42 of a severely bloated vendor contract. I was actively hunting for liability loopholes with a yellow highlighter, thoroughly immersed in the comforting, predictable world of legal compliance. When my phone suddenly vibrated across the cold granite countertop, the screen flashed with my father's name. My chest tightened immediately. He was a man of rigid routines who absolutely never called past 9 o'clock at night unless it was a medical emergency. I answered the call. my eyes still fixed on the dense legal text, and did not even bother with a greeting. I simply asked what was wrong. My father, a remarkably stoic man who had not shed a single tear since his own mother passed away 20 years ago, could not manage to form a complete, coherent sentence. He just kept gasping for air, the sound wet and broken. Finally, he choked out the words that instantly shattered my reality into unrecognizable, jagged pieces. Nolan was dead. A massive freight elevator at the Halcyon Lofts construction site had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. It had dropped 4 stories straight down the shaft. My brother was inside when the cables gave way. By Wednesday morning, the corporate machine overseeing the project was already spinning its heavy gears. The initial incident report, a heavily sanitized and sterile document forwarded to our family by a company liaison, officially classified the event as a deeply unfortunate workplace accident. But the hushed whispers from the site rapidly funneled through the project management office and leaked out to the grieving family, carried a far more toxic and deliberate narrative. The internal communications were gently but persistently suggesting that human error was the likely root cause. They were floating the idea that the site supervisor, my brother, might have carelessly bypassed standard operating protocols to speed up a late-night material transfer. I sat in my parents' dimly lit kitchen, staring at the printed email on the table, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I knew my brother better than anyone. Nolan was famously, almost obnoxiously, obsessed with safety compliance. He was the kind of man who would aggressively halt an entire day of production, costing the developers thousands of dollars, over a single missing safety harness or a slightly frayed electrical cord. The notion that he would casually override a heavy freight elevator's primary safety mechanism was not just an insulting lie. To anyone who actually knew him, it was functionally impossible. In those first 48 hours of blinding, suffocating shock, Grant played the role of the supportive, grounded partner with terrifying perfection. He immediately sent a massive catered spread of expensive food to my parents' house, enough to comfortably feed 20 people for a week. He called me constantly in soft, hushed tones, assuring me over and over that he was right there if I needed him. He handled the surface-level performance of grief beautifully. But by Thursday afternoon, a subtle, strange shift began to occur. His gentle check-in calls slowly morphed into rapid-fire, highly specific interrogations. He started asking deeply unsettling questions that had nothing to do with my emotional state. He aggressively pushed for the exact timeline of the funeral services. He asked for a preliminary look at the guest list. He repeatedly pressed me on whether any senior executives from the Halcyon Project or Blackwell Meridian, the primary developers, had formally reached out to the family. He casually tried to find out if any of the site workers or union representatives were planning to attend the memorial. Most jarringly, he wanted to know exactly what we were planning to say during the eulogy. He cleverly framed this relentless probing as deep concern, claiming he just wanted to ensure we were not taking on too much external stress, but his tone was intensely clinical. It felt significantly less like a boyfriend offering a supportive shoulder and much more like a corporate attorney conducting pretrial discovery. I was too completely submerged in the crushing, agonizing logistics of sudden death to properly process his red flags. I was entirely consumed by the grim tasks of choosing a dark mahogany casket, signing horrifying legal release forms at the county morgue, physically holding my mother upright when her knees gave out in the hallway, and making sure my father remembered to drink a glass of water every few hours. My exhausted brain simply did not have the spare bandwidth to critically analyze Grant's strange obsession with the corporate attendees of my brother's funeral. The absolute breaking point arrived on Friday night, roughly 12 hours before the memorial service was scheduled to begin. I was sitting alone at the heavy oak dining table in my childhood home, bathed in the harsh, isolating yellow light of a single desk lamp. I was staring at a blank piece of paper, desperately trying to figure out how to condense 29 years of a bright, fiercely beautiful life into a 3-minute speech. The house was entirely silent, my parents having finally collapsed into an exhausted, medicated sleep upstairs. My phone lit up in the dark. It was Grant. I picked up the call, craving just one single moment of normal, uncomplicated comfort before the hardest day of my life. He did not ask how I was holding up. He did not ask if I needed him to come over. He cleared his throat, utilizing that practiced, incredibly smooth voice he usually reserved for delicate client meetings, and delivered the exact sentence that instantly and permanently destroyed our relationship. He told me, quite calmly, that he was not going to attend the funeral the next day. I sat completely frozen in the wooden chair, the ballpoint pen slipping from my trembling fingers and rolling silently across the table. I asked him to repeat himself, absolutely certain that the sheer exhaustion was causing me to hallucinate his words. He let out a heavy, incredibly put-upon sigh. He explained, in a perfectly measured, deeply rational tone, that he barely knew Nolan. He said standing around a room full of crying strangers was, in his exact phrasing, entirely too depressing for him to handle. He went on to calmly state that attending a heavy grief event would be terrible for his generalized anxiety. He painted himself entirely as a fragile, sensitive victim who simply needed to protect his own emotional boundaries. Then came the final, sickening blow. He actually tried to soften his cowardly rejection with a compromise. He told me that after I got through all the miserable, gloomy stuff tomorrow, he would gladly take me out to a really high-end dinner on Saturday night. He suggested we could go to that expensive new Italian place downtown, drink a $200 bottle of wine, and keep my mood from completely crashing. He actually used those words. He offered to manage my mood while discussing the permanent burial of my only sibling. A normal woman might have screamed into the receiver. A normal woman might have sobbed, begged him to reconsider, or thrown the heavy phone against the living room wall in a fit of righteous, uncontrollable rage. I did none of those things. The heavy, suffocating sorrow that had been choking me for 3 unbroken days suddenly evaporated, replaced entirely by an absolute, freezing clarity. Every strange question he had asked, every overly calculated phrase he had used over the past 2 days, suddenly snapped into a sharp, horrifying focus. He was not avoiding the funeral because he was sad. He was managing a narrative. I did not argue with him. I did not plead for his presence. I simply stared out at the dark, rain-streaked window pane, listening to his steady, calm breathing on the other end of the line. I told him I understood. I said goodnight. I pressed the red button to end the call, placed the phone face down on the polished oak table, and picked up my pen. I did not shed a single tear over Grant Holloway. From that exact fraction of a second forward, the man I thought I loved ceased to exist. In his place stood a massive, glaring liability, a deeply suspicious entity directly connected to the worst tragedy of my existence. A heavy steel door slammed firmly shut inside my chest, locking him out forever. I went back to drafting my brother's eulogy, fueled no longer by overwhelming, paralyzing grief, but by a quiet, incredibly calculating, and dangerously cold purpose. The sky on Saturday morning was the color of bruised, heavy iron. I drove my parents to the memorial service myself, knowing neither of them possessed the necessary focus or hand-eye coordination to safely operate a motor vehicle. My mother sat motionless in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed blankly on the rain streaks sliding down the windshield. My father sat in the back, entirely silent. I wore a stiff, high-collared black dress that felt more like armor than clothing. I kept my spine perfectly rigid against the driver's seat and gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that if my posture faltered for even a fraction of a second, the fragile scaffolding holding my family together would instantly collapse into dust. I had to be the anchor. We pulled into the asphalt parking lot of the funeral home at exactly 9:30 in the morning. Stepping into the viewing room, the air was immediately thick with the suffocating, heavy scent of white lilies and polished mahogany. But what physically stopped me in my tracks was not the floral arrangements. It was the sheer, overwhelming volume of humanity pressed into the space. I had anticipated a modest gathering of relatives and a few close neighborhood friends. Instead, the massive room was overflowing into the hallway. There were dozens of men wearing heavy canvas work jackets and steel-toed boots. their calloused hands awkwardly clutching the delicate paper memorial programs. I recognized an old high school history teacher of his, standing quietly near the back wall with his head bowed. There were several residents from the apartment complex where he lived, including the elderly woman whose fire alarm he had fixed, leaning heavily on a wooden cane while her daughter supported her arm. I even saw the night security guard from his previous job site, the man he had driven to the emergency room years ago, wearing a dark, outdated suit that looked 2 sizes too large for his frame. They had all shown up for him. The immense gravity of my brother's life was reflected in the diverse, beautiful crowd he had accidentally gathered. In the absolute front row, specifically reserved for the immediate family, 4 padded chairs sat in a perfectly straight line facing the casket. My father slowly lowered himself into the first. My mother took the second, clutching a crumpled tissue. I sat in the third. The 4th chair remained entirely, glaringly unoccupied. That empty space, the seat explicitly designated for my partner, felt like a massive, tangible object sitting right beside my hip. It was a gaping, humiliating wound in the front row. Throughout the agonizing hour of the service, that empty chair served as a silent but deafening testament to the man who found our absolute devastation too inconvenient to witness. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, the funeral director offered me a solemn nod. I stood up, smoothing the front of my black dress, and walked slowly to the wooden podium. The microphone amplified the shaky, uneven sound of my breath. I looked out at the sea of faces and refused to speak about the tragic, violent nature of his passing. I refused to offer hollow, useless platitudes about him resting in a better place. Instead, I spoke about the granular, specific realities of who he was. I talked about how he possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to remember the exact birthday of every single person he met, keeping a chaotic and handwritten list in his truck console. I told the crowded room about his strange, beautiful habit of keeping 3 extra pairs of thick winter work gloves behind his driver's seat, constantly giving them away to anyone he saw shivering on his morning commute. I described the specific, booming resonance of his laugh and how it could completely alter the atmospheric pressure of any room he entered, turning strangers into allies. As I reached the final paragraph of the printed pages, a wave of physical agony hit my chest with the force of a concrete block. My throat closed entirely. The black ink on the paper blurred into meaningless smudges. My knees began to violently tremble against the heavy wooden podium. I was seconds away from a total physical collapse. But I dug my fingernails into the edges of the lectern, anchored my feet to the carpet, and forced myself to swallow the bile and the pain. I finished the speech with a clear, resonant voice, completely unbroken, because I knew my brother would have absolutely despised the idea of his vibrant life being entirely defined by the horrific, bleeding tragedy of its ending. After the final prayer, the heavy crowd slowly dissolved into the adjacent reception hall to drink bitter coffee and eat dry pastries. I was standing near a folding table, staring blankly at a tray of sandwiches, when a young woman cautiously approached me. She moved hesitantly, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if checking for observers before making her approach. She introduced herself as Tessa Rowe. She was the administrative assistant stationed at the Halcyon Lofts project site. Her hands were trembling visibly as she unzipped her dark leather purse. She pulled out a small, firmly sealed manila envelope and a standard black USB flash drive, pressing them urgently into my cold palms. Her voice was barely a whisper, completely drowned out by the low hum of mournful conversations surrounding us. She told me that Nolan had walked into the site trailer 2 weeks ago. He had handed her these exact items with a very specific, chilling instruction. He had told her that if anything ever happened to him on that site, under no circumstances was she to surrender these materials to the corporate office or the project managers. She was to find his sister and hand them over directly. Before I could ask a single question, Tessa turned around and quickly disappeared into the crowd of dark coats. I immediately excused myself, walking rigidly to a deserted hallway near the public restrooms. My hands shook violently as I tore open the glued flap of the manila envelope. Inside, there was no massive legal dossier, No lengthy explanation of engineering failures. There was only a single, jagged piece of yellow notebook paper. Written in my brother's unmistakable, hurried scrawl was a single terrifying sentence. It read, "If they say I bypassed protocol, do not believe them." The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. I folded the paper, slipped it and the drive into my pocket, and walked back to my parents. By 8 o'clock that evening, I was finally back inside the sterile, quiet sanctuary of my own apartment. I had not eaten a single meal in over 24 hours, but hunger was an entirely foreign concept to my nervous system. I sat on my beige sofa, the USB drive resting heavy and ominous on the glass coffee table in front of me, seeking a brief, mindless distraction before confronting whatever digital ghosts lived on that drive. I opened my personal laptop. I navigated to a private social media application, an account restricted only to a tight, exclusive circle of connections. The very first image that populated my digital feed was a fresh post from Grant. It was a sharply lit, highly filtered photograph of a lavish dining table at an exclusive downtown steakhouse. There were expensive plates of perfectly seared Wagyu beef, crystal glasses filled to the brim with dark red wine, and a caption casually bragging about closing a major corporate communications account. My eyes darted to the digital timestamp embedded in the bottom corner of the image. The photo had been uploaded to the server at exactly 10:45 in the morning. I stared at the screen, doing the agonizing math in my head. 10:45. It was the precise, exact moment I had been standing at the wooden podium, clutching my chest, desperately trying to push air through my lungs to finish my brother's eulogy. Grant was not paralyzed by crippling anxiety in his bed. He was not protecting his fragile mental health. He was drinking expensive Cabernet and eating prime meat while my family buried my brother. The true, absolute horror, however, did not arrive until the following morning. At exactly 7:30 on Sunday morning, my cell phone chimed brightly on the wooden nightstand. I reached for it, my eyes heavy with exhaustion and a severe lack of sleep. It was a text message from Grant. There was no lengthy apology. There was no delicate, careful inquiry about how I had survived the worst day of my entire existence. He simply asked, with the breezy, sickening casualness of a man confirming a movie date, if we were still on for our dinner reservations at the Italian place that evening. I stared at the glowing digital letters until my vision blurred. The complete and utter absence of human empathy, the aggressive, forced normalcy of his question, sent a violent chill racing straight down my spine that was infinitely more terrifying than open, screaming cruelty. It was the absolute, clinical detachment of a man who genuinely believed he could simply erase my trauma by aggressively refusing to acknowledge it. He thought his smooth phrasing and pristine manners had successfully managed the situation. He thought I was just a grieving, distracted woman who would eventually fall back into his perfectly ordered life without asking difficult questions. He had absolutely no idea about the yellow piece of paper sitting on my kitchen counter, or the black flash drive currently plugged into my machine. I did not reply to his message. I set the phone face down on the table. The time for crying was officially over. I did not type a single letter in response to his casual invitation for Italian food. I did not angrily block his phone number. Nor did I furiously draft a lengthy, emotionally volatile paragraph detailing the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. For the very first time in my 33 years of existence, my desperate, deeply ingrained need to explain my actions, to rationalize my feelings, or to formally close a conversational loop completely evaporated. I simply set the device face down on the cold granite surface of my kitchen island and stepped away. The profound silence that immediately settled over my apartment was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a broken victim. It was the sharp, highly calculated silence of an auditor who had just discovered a massive discrepancy in the ledger. I no longer owed Grant Holloway a single syllable of my reality. Sleep was a biological impossibility. My nervous system felt like it was humming with a high-voltage electrical current. At roughly 2:15 in the morning, the harsh, unnatural blue light of my laptop screen illuminated my exhausted face. I was mechanically scrolling through the digital archives of a prominent local city newspaper, desperate to understand the public narrative surrounding the Halcyon Lofts incident. I finally located the official press release issued by the primary developer, Blackwell Meridian. The statement was a masterclass in corporate evasion, expertly designed to shield the shareholders from liability. But it was the specific, highly polished vocabulary that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand at rigid attention. The anonymous spokesperson quoted in the article repeatedly utilized highly specific phrases to describe the accident. They called it an unauthorized manual override. They referred to it as a tragic human error. They emphatically labeled it a strictly isolated incident. I stared at the glowing pixels, my blood running completely cold. I knew the rhythmic, calculated cadence of those exact words. I had spent countless evenings sitting on my sofa, listening to Grant rehearse those precise syntactic structures while he paced around my living room, neutralizing major corporate disasters over his mobile phone. The language was entirely too sterile, too perfectly engineered to be a coincidence. A sickening, heavy knot of pure suspicion took firm root in my stomach. I opened a new browser tab and initiated a ruthless, methodical deep dive into public corporate filings, press registries, and financial disclosures. It took me less than 45 minutes to shatter the final, lingering illusion of my personal life. Vesper Lane Strategies, the elite crisis management firm where my boyfriend held a highly lucrative senior director title, had not been retained by Blackwell Meridian in the chaotic, frantic aftermath of the elevator collapse. According to a quarterly earnings report, published a full 6 months prior to the accident, Blackwell Meridian was already one of Vesper Lane's top-tier, actively retained clients. Grant had been quietly managing their public image and cashing their substantial checks the entire time we were sharing a bed. The massive conflict of interest was glaring, and his deliberate omission of this fact was a massive, waving red flag. My hands were eerily, terrifyingly steady as I reached for the black flash drive Tessa had shoved into my palms at the reception hall. I slid the metal connector into the side port of my machine. The drive instantly mounted on my desktop, revealing a single, locked master directory. Because my brother and I shared a deeply ingrained, almost pathological reliance on our shared childhood nostalgia, I bypassed the security measure on my first attempt. The password was the name of our first golden retriever, typed entirely in lowercase letters. The folder immediately unlocked, spilling its grim, devastating contents directly across my screen. I spent the next 3 hours dissecting the digital anatomy of a completely preventable tragedy. I bypassed the folders containing mundane scheduling documents and clicked directly into the photographic evidence. There were dozens of high-resolution images meticulously documenting severe terminal wear on the heavy machinery. I saw completely rusted tension springs, deeply frayed steel hoist cables that looked ready to snap under minimal pressure, and a primary brake caliper completely stripped of its protective metal housing. Alongside the terrifying images were multiple saved copies of urgent, aggressively worded emails Nolan had sent to the upper project management team. He had explicitly and repeatedly requested an immediate mandatory halt on the freight elevator's operation until a certified, independent mechanic could perform a thorough inspection. Every single one of his requests had been met with a patronizing, highly dismissive reply from the developers. They cited impossible budget constraints, complained about the aggressively tight timeline, and stated firmly that the project allowed zero room for maintenance delays. My brother had highlighted the most damning dismissals in a bright, neon red digital marker, leaving a glaring trail of their absolute negligence. Then, I opened a basic spreadsheet titled Fourth Quarter Risk Assessment Meetings. My eyes systematically scanned down the neat rows of dates and corporate attendees until my vision completely locked onto a specific cell dated exactly 9 days before the crash. The entry was logged simply as a G.H. briefing. My internal temperature plummeted. G.H. Grant Holloway. He was not just tangentially aware of the massive construction project from a distance. He was sitting directly in the conference room, actively briefing the senior executives on how to strategically manage the immense public relations risk of their crumbling, dangerously unmaintained infrastructure. The discovery of those initials triggered a violently clear, almost cinematic flashback that made me physically nauseous. Roughly 3 weeks ago, Grant and I were sitting closely together on my living room sofa, sharing a $40 bottle of imported red wine. He had gently rubbed my tense shoulders and asked, in a tone dripping with perfectly manufactured empathy, if Nolan seemed overly stressed with the Halcyon project lately. He had casually, almost smoothly, inquired if my brother was losing sleep, or if the intense, daily pressure of the job site was making him prone to reckless, impulsive decisions. At the time, my heart had swelled with foolish affection, genuinely believing my partner was deeply, personally invested in my family's well-being. Now, staring at the cold, hard digital footprint of his ultimate betrayal, the bitter taste of bile rose sharply in my throat. He was not caring for me. He was conducting targeted opposition research. He was actively mining my personal life for psychological vulnerabilities he could strategically weaponize against my own brother in the event of a catastrophic structural failure. He was laying the groundwork for the human error narrative right in the middle of my living room, using my own blind trust to gather his ammunition. The final, most important file in the directory was an audio recording, labeled simply with the date of his death. I clicked the play icon, physically bracing myself against the hard wooden edge of my desk. Nolan's voice filled the quiet room, sounding incredibly exhausted, severely strained, but fiercely, undeniably resolute. He spoke directly into the microphone, his heavy breathing highly audible. He stated clearly, for the record, that the upper management team was aggressively trying to force him to sign off on a completely falsified safety audit to keep the project moving forward. Then, his tone dropped a full octave, carrying a chilling, prophetic weight that made my chest physically ache. He said that if he ended up getting fired, or if anything worse happened on the site, and someone suddenly tried to spin a convenient story that he had lost his mind or his strict grip on standard safety protocols, they were absolutely lying. He told whoever was listening to look at the paper trail. He knew they were coming for his reputation. The audio file ended, leaving me sitting in a deafening, ringing silence. The standard, emotionally driven protocol for a severely betrayed woman would dictate a tearful, screaming, chaotic confrontation. I should have picked up my cellular phone right then, at 5:30 in the morning, dialed his number, and furiously demanded a complete explanation. I should have thrown his massive hypocrisy directly in his face and watched him desperately scramble to deploy his professional lies. But I am a compliance specialist. I do not deal in screaming matches, and I absolutely do not deal in fragile, easily manipulated emotions. I operate strictly on the irrefutable, rock-solid bedrock of documented, physical proof. I immediately disconnected my laptop from the wireless internet network to prevent any possibility of remote tampering or accidental deletion. I retrieved a massive 2 terabyte external hard drive from my home office drawer and plugged it in. I systematically and methodically cloned every single file, every photograph, and every audio recording. I took dozens of high-resolution screenshots of the file metadata, meticulously capturing the exact creation dates and modification times to establish an unbreakable, legally sound chain of custody. I created 3 separate, heavily encrypted digital backups, storing one on the external drive, one on a secure cloud server, and leaving one on the original flash drive. Then, I woke up my heavy-duty laser printer. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in my dark apartment was the rhythmic, mechanical hum of white paper feeding continuously through the machine. I printed vivid, full-color hard copies of every email, every photograph, and every damning spreadsheet. I organized them into pristine, brand-new manila folders, labeling them precisely with a thick black marker. I was no longer a grieving, broken sister crying over an empty chair at a funeral. I was an archivist actively preparing for an absolute war. I did not want an insincere apology, and I did not want a messy, dramatic, romantic breakup. I wanted an ironclad, completely indestructible cage of truth, forged so flawlessly and backed by so much undeniable data that no amount of corporate money or slick public relations spin could ever possibly bend the bars. I met Tessa Rowe on a bleak Tuesday afternoon at a dilapidated diner on the extreme outskirts of the city, deliberately choosing a location miles away from the polished glass towers and expensive coffee shops of the financial district. The air inside smelled heavily of stale frying oil and burnt filter coffee. Tessa slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite me, her eyes darting nervously toward the rain-streaked windows. She kept her thick winter coat zipped all the way up to her chin, clutching a ceramic mug with both hands, as if she were desperately trying to extract heat from it. Without wasting time on pleasantries, she began to outline the sheer magnitude of the corruption occurring behind the locked gates of the Halcyon Lofts project. Tessa explained that Nolan had formally logged 3 distinct, highly detailed technical warnings regarding the failing mechanical systems of the primary freight elevator. He had documented severe hydraulic fluid leaks, dangerous friction wear on the main braking calipers, and unacceptable tension loss in the steel hoisting cables. He had submitted these critical reports directly to the senior project managers on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 months. Every single time, his urgent requests to halt the machinery for a mandatory overhaul were aggressively denied. The corporate handover date was exactly 60 days away, and the developers were facing penalties of tens of thousands of dollars for every single day the project fell behind schedule. Progress was the only metric that mattered. Safety was viewed merely as an expensive, highly inconvenient suggestion. But what truly chilled me was what Tessa revealed about my brother's state of mind during his final 14 days on the site. Nolan had not just been stressed. He had been deeply, profoundly paranoid. He confided in Tessa that he noticed upper management starting to actively exclude him from routine logistical meetings. They were quietly altering daily work logs and deliberately ignoring his email chains. Nolan told her he was absolutely certain they were preparing a scapegoat. He knew that if the crumbling infrastructure finally gave way, the executives up in the high-rises were not going to absorb the blame. They were going to drop the entire weight of the inevitable disaster squarely onto the shoulders of the working-class safety supervisor. I returned to my quiet apartment and immediately spread the freshly printed physical documents across my living room rug, organizing them with the cold, methodical precision of a forensic auditor. I cross-referenced the dates of Nolan's ignored safety warnings with the internal financial records I had extracted from the flash drive. Buried deep within a folder of vendor receipts, I found a highly specific billing invoice submitted by Vesper Lane Strategies to Blackwell Meridian. The line item was vaguely titled as a specialized messaging orientation workshop for senior leadership. I looked closely at the date stamped on the top right corner of the invoice. Grant had personally led this high-level executive workshop exactly 8 days before the catastrophic mechanical failure that killed my brother. He had not been hired after the tragedy to clean up a sudden, unexpected public relations nightmare. He had been actively retained beforehand to preemptively design the corporate shield. A sudden sickening thought seized my brain. I dropped the printed invoice, snatched my cellular phone from the kitchen counter, and opened my digital text message history with Grant. I scrolled aggressively backward through months of seemingly normal, mundane daily conversations. Stripped of the romantic context, viewed now through the sharp, unforgiving lens of an active investigation, his casually typed words transformed into something deeply sinister. Questions that I had once warmly interpreted as genuine partnerly concern were suddenly exposed as highly targeted, predatory interrogations. On a Thursday evening in late September, Grant had sent a message asking if Nolan was suffering from insomnia again, adding a sad face emoji to feign empathy. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, he casually inquired if my brother ever lost his heavy temper with his construction crew when the corporate deadlines got dangerously tight. Just 5 days before the accident, while we were picking out groceries, he had asked me if Nolan was feeling overwhelmed, specifically fishing to see if my brother had ever admitted to cutting corners just to get the job done and go home early. I sat on the floor, the glowing screen of the phone blurring as a wave of absolute horror washed over me. I felt physically violated. The intimate, vulnerable details I had whispered to the man I slept next to had been meticulously and ruthlessly harvested. I had unknowingly handed Grant the exact psychological ammunition he needed. He had weaponized my blind trust to construct a highly credible, entirely fabricated profile of an unstable, exhausted, and reckless site supervisor. He was casually interviewing me to build the exact narrative that would eventually be used to destroy my brother's legacy. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place when I opened a confidential internal email chain circulated between Blackwell Meridian's legal team and Grant's firm. The document contained a comprehensive crisis communication matrix. It was a pre-packaged contingency plan, explicitly outlining how the developers should respond in the event of a catastrophic structural failure or a severe fatal accident on site. In the column detailing the primary defense strategy, a specific, highly polished bullet point dictated the exact protocol. The document instructed the corporate spokespeople to forcefully emphasize the personal error and the unauthorized, impulsive actions of the site supervisor. They had the lie fully drafted, printed, and ready to deploy before Nolan even stepped into that elevator cage. I did not shed a tear. The sheer density of the betrayal had completely calcified my grief into something resembling solid iron. I meticulously packed every single printed folder, the original flash drive, and my heavily encrypted external backup drive into a thick leather briefcase. I put on my sharpest, most professional charcoal blazer and drove directly to the downtown high-rise office of Ada Keene. Ada was a highly specialized, absolutely ruthless civil litigator who dealt exclusively in cases of corporate wrongful death and severe institutional negligence. She was a woman who lived her life entirely within the rigid boundaries of subpoenas, depositions, and crushing financial settlements. She did not offer me a warm cup of coffee, and she did not look at me with useless, patronizing pity. She wore an impeccable navy suit and possessed the cold, deeply calculating eyes of a predator analyzing a fresh hunting ground. I sat across from her massive glass desk and laid out the physical evidence. I walked her through the exact timeline, the heavily delayed maintenance schedules, the ignored safety citations, the billing invoices from Vesper Lane, and the devastating text messages proving Grant's active role in mining my personal life for corporate intelligence. Ada did not interrupt me once. She reviewed the documents in absolute, unbroken silence for 45 solid minutes, her sharp eyes scanning the highlighted paragraphs and the printed photographs of the rusted elevator components. When she finally closed the last manila folder, she folded her hands on top of it. She did not offer me a single word of emotional comfort. She did not promise me that everything was going to be completely fine. Instead, she leaned forward and delivered a single, razor-sharp sentence that fundamentally altered my entire chemical makeup and brought my roaring mind to a point of perfect clarity. She told me that if these executives chose to turn a dead man into a convenient corporate shield, we were going to actively force them to do it under the crushing weight of a legal oath. I walked out of her glass-paneled office and stepped into the descending elevator. The damp, cold air of the city felt different against my skin. For the very first time since the morning of the funeral, I no longer felt like a broken, helpless sister drowning in the overwhelming wake of a sudden tragedy. I felt the heavy, undeniable power of the physical records locked inside my briefcase. I had officially become the keeper of the absolute truth, and I was going to use every single piece of paper I possessed to tear their perfectly constructed world completely apart. My phone became an unrelenting, vibrating beacon of manufactured panic. Grant's messages, initially constructed as gentle inquiries, rapidly devolved into a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By Monday afternoon, the tone of his texts shifted from pathetic begging to barely concealed irritation. He demanded to know exactly where I was. He accused me of completely disappearing on him during a critical moment in our relationship. He typed lengthy, self-righteous paragraphs lecturing me on how shutting down was not how mature adults handled interpersonal conflict. He actively tried to paint my absolute purposeful silence as a toxic personality flaw, completely ignoring the glaring reality that he had abandoned me on the absolute worst day of my life. He wanted to make my reaction the problem, effectively erasing his own betrayal from the equation. Then came the secondary wave of attack. At roughly 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, my screen flashed with an incoming call from Grant's older sister, Chloe. I answered the device, saying absolutely nothing, simply letting her speak into the silence. She immediately launched into a highly rehearsed, deeply condescending monologue. She sharply reprimanded me, stating that I was unfairly punishing a good, sensitive man simply because he chose to set a healthy boundary with a heavy grief event. I listened to her use sterile, therapeutic buzzwords to justify an act of profound cowardice. She argued that Grant was highly empathetic and therefore uniquely vulnerable to the emotional weight of a memorial service. In that brief, infuriating phone call, I realized that his entire family operated under the exact same pathological delusion. They filtered every single event in the universe through the highly distorted lens of their own personal comfort. If a situation made them feel bad, they simply opted out, and anyone who held them accountable was immediately branded as toxic. I hung up the phone without offering her a single syllable in response. By Wednesday morning, the collateral damage campaign reached our mutual acquaintances. My phone chimed constantly with messages from people I had previously considered friends. They told me Grant was a complete wreck. They said he was suffering from severe insomnia, pacing his expensive apartment, completely bewildered and desperately trying to understand what he had done wrong. He was actively deploying a highly effective victim narrative, effectively recentering the entire tragedy around his own emotional confusion. He was turning my brother's fatal accident into a story about a man whose grieving girlfriend had inexplicably lost her mind and aggressively shut him out. The sheer audacity of his performance was breathtaking. He was drowning out my family's actual, bleeding devastation with the overwhelming noise of his bruised ego. I did not reply to any of those friends. I simply archived the digital threads, adding their names to the rapidly growing list of things I was permanently severing from my life. When direct manipulation and social pressure completely failed to force a reaction out of me, Grant attempted a backdoor approach. On Thursday evening, I was sitting at the wooden kitchen table with my mother, silently sorting through a massive stack of sympathy cards. Her cellular phone buzzed loudly against the wood. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened a direct message. It was from Grant. He had bypassed me entirely, adopting the tone of a deeply concerned, highly responsible partner. He wrote that he was terrified for my mental state, claiming I had completely detached from reality. He begged my mother for an opportunity to come over and heal the unfortunate misunderstanding between us. My mother read the message twice. She looked up at me, her eyes completely exhausted but incredibly sharp. I knew it was the exact right moment. I stood up, walked into my home office, and retrieved the thick leather briefcase containing the physical evidence I had meticulously compiled. I brought it back to the kitchen table and laid it out directly in front of her. I showed her the billing invoices, the project maintenance requests Nolan had desperately flagged, and the specific text messages Grant had used to mine my private life for corporate intelligence. I watched her read the printed draft of the crisis communication strategy that planned to blame her dead son for his own murder. I expected her to break down. I expected her to scream or dissolve into hysterical, uncontrollable tears. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness washed over her entire body. The deep, agonizing grief that had hunched her shoulders for the past week instantly hardened into a sheet of pure, unbreakable ice. She did not raise her voice. She picked up her phone with hands that were suddenly perfectly steady. She did not ask for a lengthy explanation, and she did not engage in an emotional debate. She typed a single, brutally concise sentence. She commanded Grant Holloway to never, under any circumstances, attempt to contact any member of the Mitchell family ever again. She pressed send, permanently blocked his number, and placed the phone face down on the table. The Mitchell women were officially done crying. Less than an hour after my mother sent that final, severing text message, the digital landscape of the entire situation fundamentally shifted. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, a scheduled, automated digital communication bypassed every single corporate firewall. It was an email deployed from a highly secure, heavily encrypted secondary account that Nolan had quietly maintained outside of the company's internal servers. The message was explicitly programmed to operate as a dead man's switch, set to automatically trigger if he failed to log in and reset the timer for 7 consecutive days. The recipient list was a tactical masterpiece. It was sent simultaneously to me, to Ada Keene, to the regional director of the Heavy Construction Workers Union, and directly to the independent insurance auditing department underwriting the massive Halcyon Lofts project. I opened the secure attachment with trembling fingers. It was a formal, legally binding contingency safety declaration. Nolan had written and signed it exactly 48 hours before the steel cable snapped. In the document, my brother explicitly and thoroughly detailed his absolute refusal to sign off on a series of falsified safety confirmations the upper management had placed directly on his desk. He stated, with chilling, irrefutable clarity, that the project leaders were aggressively pushing him to approve structural integrity tests that had never actually been performed on the machinery. But the most devastating paragraph was situated near the bottom of the page. Nolan wrote that he had grown deeply suspicious of the sudden, unexplained presence of an external public relations consultant on the job site. He explicitly noted his profound fear that the developer was actively coordinating with this media team to proactively construct a scapegoat narrative. He documented his belief that they were actively preparing to pin the inevitable mechanical failure entirely on the personal negligence of the site supervisor. He knew they were digging his professional grave before he even stepped into the elevator shaft. I scrolled down to the supplementary appendix attached to the end of the declaration. It was a scanned, high-resolution copy of a handwritten sign-in sheet for an emergency, off-the-books executive meeting held in the corporate trailer the day before the accident. My eyes scanned the messy signatures of the project financiers and the senior site managers. Right there, halfway down the lined page, was a signature I had seen on dozens of restaurant receipts and birthday cards: Grant Holloway. His name was permanently, undeniably inked onto the manifest of the exact meeting where my brother's professional execution had been finalized. The truth hit me with the undeniable, crushing weight of a collapsing building. Grant did not simply skip the funeral because he was uncomfortable with the sight of a grieving family. He skipped it because he was actively, fundamentally complicit in the cover-up. He was an instrumental link in the corporate chain designed to completely eradicate my brother's honor and reputation. While my parents and I were picking out a heavy wooden casket and struggling to pull air into our lungs, Grant was sitting in secure boardrooms, finalizing the exact vocabulary they would use to destroy Nolan's name. He had actively tried to execute this character assassination before we even had the chance to, before we even reached the graveside. My phone sat silently on the granite counter. The overwhelming, chaotic noise of Grant's frantic text messages, his sister's condescending lecture, and the misplaced pity of our mutual friends had completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by the deafening roar of absolute documented truth. They had severely underestimated the quiet, highly organized woman who lived her entire life by the rigid rules of compliance. They had foolishly assumed my lack of a screaming reaction was a symptom of weakness and overwhelming, paralyzing sorrow. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was actually the precise, terrifying sound of a steel trap securely locking shut around their ankles. On a dreary Monday morning, a heavy, wax-sealed courier envelope arrived at my parents' house. It was not sent directly by Blackwell Meridian, but rather funneled cleanly through an anonymous, high-end third-party mediation firm. Inside rested a painfully thick stack of legal documents and a formal offer for a Goodwill financial support package. The proposed amount was a staggering $650,000. To a family drowning in sudden funeral costs and emotional devastation, it looked like a lifeline. But buried on page 42 was the absolute poison, an aggressively worded, airtight non-disparagement agreement. It explicitly legally bound every member of the Mitchell family from ever making a single public statement that could potentially harm the corporate reputation of the Halcyon Lofts project. My father, a man whose spirit had been entirely hollowed out over the past 10 days, stared at the zeros printed on the thick paper. He looked incredibly old, his shoulders completely defeated. He reached for a black pen, his hand shaking, murmuring that maybe we should just sign the damn thing and finally let Nolan rest. He just wanted the suffocating, relentless nightmare to end. I moved across the kitchen instantly, placing my hand firmly over his. Ada Keene had explicitly warned me this exact tactic was coming. I looked my father directly in the eyes and told him we could not sign it. I explained that this was not an act of corporate generosity. It was a preemptive gag order. They were desperately trying to purchase our total silence before the actual, damning maintenance files inevitably leaked to the regulatory agencies. My father dropped the pen, burying his face in his rough hands, but he did not sign the paper. Later that same afternoon, Tessa initiated another secure, encrypted digital transfer. This time, she had managed to bypass the administrative firewall to access the project management's internal instant messaging platform. The screenshots she delivered were not carefully polished corporate emails. They were the raw, unfiltered, deeply cynical conversations happening in real time behind closed doors. I read a message from the senior director of operations describing my deceased brother not as a tragic loss of life, but explicitly as an issue that could be easily contained with the appropriate narrative application. But the absolute hardest blow, the exact moment my blood felt like it froze solid in my veins, came 3 screenshots down. It was a direct, time-stamped message sent from Grant's verified corporate account to the lead legal counsel of Blackwell Meridian. The text was brutally clear. Grant wrote that they needed to take immediate, proactive steps to keep Nolan's sister entirely away from the original site maintenance logs. He explicitly warned them that I worked in corporate compliance. He typed, word for word, that I was professionally trained to read the exact, minute discrepancies that normal people simply gloss over. My hands actually violently trembled holding the phone. I had to place the device flat on the desk just to keep reading. This single screenshot fundamentally changed the entire architecture of his betrayal. Grant had not just passively exploited the intimate secrets I shared with him in bed. He had actively, systematically calculated my professional capabilities and pinpointed me as the primary threat to their cover-up. He had designed a specific, targeted strategy to completely neutralize me. The man I had planned to marry had viewed me strictly as an operational liability that needed to be managed and kept deeply in the dark. As if the universe demanded I witness the absolute, bottomless depth of his hypocrisy. Another message arrived an hour later. This one came from a mutual acquaintance, a woman who had always been quietly observant. She sent me a batch of screenshots taken from a private group chat populated by several of Grant's closest friends. In the thread, Grant was fully committed to his aggressively fabricated victimhood. He complained bitterly to his peers that I had completely and totally ghosted him. He claimed my sudden silence was a wildly toxic overreaction simply because he had bravely chosen to prioritize his own fragile mental health boundaries during a highly triggering week. He was actively painting a masterful portrait of himself as the sensitive, misunderstood casualty of a hysterical, deeply unstable woman broken by grief. Every instinct wired into human nature screamed at me to defend myself. I desperately wanted to capture the screenshots of his internal corporate messages, post them aggressively on every public social media platform, and publicly obliterate his pathetic, lying narrative. I wanted to scream the truth until my throat bled, but I remembered the cold, sharp advice Ada Keene had drilled into my head during our initial meeting. She told me that silence is a predator's absolute worst nightmare. If I reacted publicly, if I posted an angry status, or attempted to clear my name in the social arena, I would instantly give Grant the opportunity to adjust his defensive strategy. I would be showing him my cards. So, I did not type a single public rebuttal. I let his disgusting lies continue to breathe and circulate completely unchallenged. I allowed him to construct a massive, fragile glass house of public sympathy, knowing exactly how heavy the stone I was preparing to throw would be. The final, undeniable nail in his coffin arrived late Tuesday evening. Tessa, proving herself to be an absolute genius at digital extraction, had managed to pull the raw security badge data from the main lobby turnstiles of the Blackwell Meridian corporate headquarters. She cross-referenced the employee identification numbers and found the exact digital footprint she was hunting for. The spreadsheet clearly displayed Grant Holloway's unique visitor badge swiping through the high-security electronic gates on the 42nd floor. The digital timestamp logged his entry at exactly 10:15 in the morning on the previous Saturday. It logged his exit at 2:45 in the afternoon. I stared at the numbers until they burned into my retinas. 10:15 in the morning on Saturday, the exact minute my mother was being physically supported as she walked down the aisle of the funeral home. While I was standing behind a wooden podium, staring out at an ocean of weeping construction workers and broken family members, Grant was not huddled in his dark apartment suffering from a crippling anxiety attack. He was sitting securely in a climate-controlled corporate war room, drinking bottled water, and actively managing the communications strategy designed to destroy the reputation of the man we were currently burying. Right then, in the absolute quiet of my dimly lit home office, a profound and permanent shift occurred within my psychology. The lingering, pathetic ache of a broken romance completely vanished, entirely replaced by a singular, diamond-hard objective. My goal was no longer to simply end a toxic relationship or achieve a quiet, personal closure. My objective was total, undeniable, public accountability. I was going to meticulously force every single person who had callously viewed my brother's funeral as a convenient window of corporate opportunity to pay the ultimate price. I was going to use their own data, their own timestamps, and their own arrogance to drag the absolute truth directly into the harsh, unforgiving light of a courtroom. On a brisk Tuesday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Ada Keene officially submitted the massive civil complaint to the county courthouse. I sat quietly in the heavy leather chair across from her polished desk as she finalized the electronic filing. The sheer weight of the document was staggering. It was not a simple request for standard financial compensation. It was a highly aggressive, meticulously documented lawsuit for wrongful death, resulting from severe, deliberate safety violations, coupled with a secondary, devastating claim for the intentional defamation of the deceased. The filing explicitly and boldly named Blackwell Meridian as the primary defendant. It targeted the specific contracting firm operating the heavy machinery. Most importantly, it dragged Vesper Lane Strategies directly into the blinding light of legal scrutiny. The era of my quiet, agonizing grief was officially over. The era of their public, documented dismantling had begun. By 2:30 that same afternoon, the carefully constructed walls of my former partner's reality began to violently crack. My securely encrypted inbox chimed with an incoming message from his personal email address, entirely bypassing his usual corporate servers. The message was a frantic, chaotic mess of terrified backpedaling. All of his highly polished, expertly crafted public relations vocabulary had completely evaporated. He wrote in long, desperate paragraphs, claiming he never once wanted things to escalate to this catastrophic level. He aggressively pleaded for a private, off-the-record conversation. He swore he just needed 30 minutes to look me in the eyes and properly explain the nuance of the situation. I agreed to his desperate request, but I did not feel a single, fleeting ounce of lingering mercy or romantic nostalgia. I immediately forwarded his digital plea to Ada. We completely stripped the upcoming encounter of any emotional intimacy. I allowed my attorney to handle every single logistical detail. We were absolutely not going to meet at a dimly lit, comfortable coffee shop to hold hands and cry over a tragic misunderstanding. Ada reserved a severely sterile, glass-walled conference room located in a highly secure legal building in the financial district. We strategically transformed his pathetic attempt at personal reconciliation into a highly controlled, deeply calculated information-gathering exercise. However, the most valuable piece of ammunition arrived the night before our scheduled sit-down. In a frantic attempt to soften the ground before he faced me, he sent a lengthy, profoundly pathetic explanatory letter. As I read the black text glowing on my monitor, I uncovered the most physically repulsive, sickening truth of this entire nightmare. He finally confessed the actual, undeniable reason he had refused to stand by my side on the day we buried my brother. It had absolutely nothing to do with a sudden, crippling wave of generalized anxiety. It had nothing to do with protecting his fragile mental health boundaries. He admitted, in his own written words, that he stayed away because he was utterly terrified of being exposed. He knew with absolute certainty that if he walked into that crowded viewing room, several of the senior construction foremen and union representatives would instantly recognize his face. They would immediately identify him as the exact corporate consultant who had spent the previous 2 weeks in their on-site trailers, actively orchestrating the strategic narrative explicitly designed to blame my brother for the fatal mechanical failure. He actually attempted to justify this monstrous, calculated betrayal by deploying the most cowardly, ethically bankrupt defense imaginable. He wrote that he was simply doing his job, bound by strict non-disclosure agreements and client obligations. He treated his high-paying corporate position as a universal, impenetrable shield against basic human decency. He genuinely believed that securing a lucrative public relations contract somehow granted him full moral immunity to participate in the destruction of a dead man's legacy. He had absolutely no idea what a monumental, catastrophic mistake he had just made. That single rambling letter instantly became an absolutely priceless piece of documentary evidence. In his frantic, deeply arrogant rush to secure my forgiveness and manage his own guilt, he had permanently and directly linked his cowardly absence at the memorial service to the massive, highly unethical conflict of interest he had been so desperately trying to conceal. He had literally put his own active complicity into writing, complete with a digital timestamp. The internal corporate fallout was beautifully, brutally swift. Within 24 hours of Ada serving the preliminary discovery notices, Vesper Lane Strategies officially suspended him without a single cent of pay. They scrambled frantically to protect their own massive corporate liability, instantly treating their formerly untouchable golden boy like a highly contagious disease. Yet, behind the heavily locked boardroom doors, their high-priced legal teams were still aggressively attempting to orchestrate a quiet, backroom negotiation. They dispatched urgent communications to Ada, drastically increasing the proposed financial settlement figures. They went from offering $650,000 to casually floating numbers well over $2 million. They were practically begging my legal team to take a massive, life-altering check and quietly withdraw our aggressive, unyielding demands for their internal digital archives and communications logs. The sudden violent legal shockwaves inevitably caught the sharp attention of the local press. A senior investigative reporter from the city's most prominent publications started aggressively digging, smelling the distinct, unmistakable stench of a massive corporate cover-up. She left 3 urgent, highly persuasive voicemails on my cell phone, promising me a massive front-page expose and prime television coverage. I listened to her impassioned pleas, but I explicitly instructed Ada to formally decline the interview request. I had zero interest in trying this complex case in the chaotic, highly unpredictable court of public opinion. I did not want to secure a victory through loud, messy media noise, viral outrage, or tearful television appearances. I was strictly playing a much colder, infinitely more devastating long game. I wanted to win utilizing a concrete, absolutely impenetrable mountain of physical records, signed affidavits, and digital timestamps that no highly paid corporate spokesperson or slick television lawyer could ever possibly refute. As the week finally drew to a close, it became chillingly, almost comically obvious that my former partner still completely failed to grasp the sheer magnitude of the avalanche currently roaring toward him. Late Thursday evening, he sent one final, brief email confirming his attendance at our scheduled meeting for the following morning. His tone had bizarrely shifted back to that familiar, overly confident, deeply patronizing smoothness. He genuinely, truly believed he could still charm his way out of the corner he had painted himself into. He operated under the profound delusion that if he just sat across from me in that glass room, flashed his perfectly practiced apologetic smile, offered a retroactive apology filled with therapeutic buzzwords, and perhaps promised a slightly larger, confidential financial payout, everything would magically disappear. He still blindly trusted the silver tongue and the carefully crafted charisma that had successfully navigated him out of every single previous professional disaster of his entire adult life. He had absolutely no idea that I was no longer coming to the conference room to listen to him speak. I was coming to watch the heavy doors lock behind him. The formal discovery phase of the civil lawsuit turned Ada Keene's office into a suffocating, windowless bunker of corporate rot. We had successfully subpoenaed the internal communications of Blackwell Meridian and Vesper Lane Strategies, resulting in a digital dump of over 4 terabytes of raw data. For 3 exhausting days, I sat in a severely climate-controlled conference room, staring at dual monitors until my vision blurred. The air in the room felt progressively heavier, thick with the undeniable, claustrophobic reality of how deeply I had been manipulated. Every single file we unsealed peeled back another layer of the meticulously engineered lie, locking every piece of evidence directly to one specific name. The most visceral violation surfaced on a Wednesday afternoon. We were parsing through a heavily encrypted email chain between Grant's private work server and the lead defense attorneys for the developers. Attached to an email labeled simply as Supervisor Psychological Profile, I found dozens of high-resolution screenshots. They were my own private text messages. I read my own words, typed late at night from the sanctuary of my bedroom months ago, staring back at me. I had texted Grant that Nolan was incredibly exhausted from the project. I had affectionately complained that my brother was far too stubborn for his own good, mentioning how he was stubbornly refusing to sign off on what he called shady paperwork. Those intimate, highly vulnerable fragments of my life, shared in total confidence with the man I loved, had been violently weaponized. Grant had systematically screenshotted my private worries and forwarded them directly to corporate legal counsel. He had actively transformed my sisterly concern into documented evidence of Nolan's supposed insubordination and mental instability. He had turned my bed into an active surveillance operation. Less than an hour after finding the texts, Ada silently slid a printed document across the glass table. It was the first rough draft of the public press release regarding the fatal elevator collapse. I immediately looked at the digital timestamp automatically generated in the footer of the page. The document had been created at exactly 11:45 at night on the very day my brother died. That was barely 2 hours after the steel cables snapped. It was hours before the county coroner even formally released the body, and well before my father received the initial, sanitized phone call from the site manager. Yet, right there in the second paragraph, Grant had already drafted the exact, highly polished vocabulary required to pin the entire catastrophic failure on the personal negligence of the site supervisor. Before my family even knew Nolan was gone, Grant was sitting at his laptop, methodically constructing the narrative that my brother had recklessly abandoned standard operating procedures. The timeline was completely, irrefutably damning. The structural lies collapsed completely when we finally recovered the original, unaltered digital maintenance logs from the main server rack. The restored files provided absolute mechanical proof. The logs clearly showed that Nolan had manually engaged the heavy emergency safety lock on the freight elevator, officially tagging it as completely out of service pending a severe hydraulic inspection. But a secondary entry, logged just 12 hours later by an unidentified corporate master key, showed that the safety lock had been intentionally, manually overridden and removed to force the machinery back into operation to meet the strict delivery deadlines. The final piece of the operational timeline locked into place when Ada uncovered a hidden calendar invitation buried in a deleted folder. The meeting was scheduled for the late evening exactly 1 day before the fatal accident. There were only 3 required attendees listed on the digital manifest: the project's chief financial officer, the head of site operations, and Grant Holloway. The subject line of the meeting was labeled as preemptive risk containment regarding the safety supervisor bottleneck. It was absolute, documented proof that the corporate executives knew the infrastructure was failing. They knew Nolan was refusing to let them cut corners, and they had actively brought Grant into a locked room to strategize how to control the damage before the inevitable tragedy even occurred. The sheer, overwhelming weight of this protracted legal warfare was heavily taking its toll on my parents. On a quiet Sunday evening, I sat in their dimly lit living room, watching them physically wither under the intense pressure. The opposing legal team had sent another massive, aggressive settlement offer, completely bypassing Ada and attempting to exploit my family's emotional exhaustion. They were offering an absolutely staggering sum of money in exchange for completely sealing the records and terminating the lawsuit. My father stared blankly at the thick legal packet on the coffee table. He looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes and whispered that perhaps we should just take the money and finally bury the past. He said he simply did not have the strength to fight these massive corporations anymore. My heart physically ached for him, but I absolutely refused to yield. I knelt in front of his chair, gripped his cold hands, and spoke with a terrifying, unshakable clarity. I explained that if we signed that confidential agreement, we were formally accepting their money in exchange for Nolan's honor. Signing meant my brother would forever exist in the public record as the reckless, negligent fool who caused a fatal disaster. I told my parents that I would rather lose every single dollar to my name than allow the world to remember Nolan as a corporate liability. They wept quietly, but they completely understood. The unsigned settlement offer went straight into the paper shredder. Sensing his rapidly impending professional execution, Grant's personal defense attorney attempted to initiate a completely separate, desperate backdoor negotiation. They formally offered a massive private settlement, proposing a substantial financial payout entirely from Grant's personal accounts, accompanied by a formally drafted letter of apology. However, the proposed apology was heavily redacted, containing strict legal language explicitly stating that the letter constituted absolutely no admission of formal guilt or liability. I rejected the proposal the exact minute Ada read it to me. I knew with absolute certainty that a legally mandated, heavily guarded secret apology was just another sophisticated, expensive variation of a gag order. I did not want his money, and I certainly did not want his empty, heavily lawyered remorse. The ultimate, devastating weapon arrived via an encrypted download link from Tessa. It was the final, deeply buried file extracted from Nolan's secondary cloud backup server. It was a brief, highly compressed audio recording. I played the file through the heavy studio speakers in Ada's office. The room filled with the unmistakable, slightly gravelly sound of my brother's voice, recorded against the loud background noise of heavy construction equipment. Nolan sounded completely exhausted, his breathing heavy, but his words were sharp and deliberate. He stated clearly that he was being entirely boxed out of the site management loop. Then, the audio cracked slightly as he leaned closer to the microphone. He said that if anything catastrophic happened on the site, the authorities needed to start their investigation directly with Grant Holloway. My brother's voice echoed off the glass walls, stating that Grant smiled exactly like a man who was busy paving a smooth road for a massive lie. Hearing that warning, spoken from beyond the grave, completely extinguished any remaining shred of humanity I felt toward the man I once intended to marry. The heavy, suffocating anticipation finally peaked the night before the official, sworn depositions were scheduled to begin. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, mechanically reviewing the final timeline binders, when my phone vibrated. I opened a public social media application and saw that Grant had just published a lengthy, highly polished public statement. He was still entirely, pathetically oblivious to the sheer volume of hard evidence sitting in my briefcase. He still genuinely believed the core of our conflict revolved entirely around his failure to attend a memorial service. His post was a masterclass in hypocritical, therapeutic manipulation. He wrote a sprawling essay about the critical importance of respecting personal mental health boundaries. He waxed poetic about how society must absolutely stop judging the difficult, highly personal decisions people are forced to make while navigating the dark, complex waters of profound grief. He was actively constructing a massive, public fortress of unearned sympathy, trying to win an emotional argument on the internet. I read every single word of his pathetic, arrogant performance. I did not feel a spike of anger. I felt nothing but a cold, absolute, and terrifying calm. I locked the glowing screen of my phone and tossed it onto the nightstand. I stood up and carefully laid out my sharpest, darkest charcoal suit across the back of my armchair, preparing my armor for the following morning. Grant was wasting his time fighting a shallow, emotional war for likes and shares on a digital platform. I fully understood that the final, decapitating blow of this entire ordeal was never going to happen in a comments section. It was going to happen tomorrow morning, securely locked inside a sterile, windowless legal chamber, seated entirely under the crushing weight of a sworn oath. Exactly where Grant Holloway would either be forced to speak the absolute truth or completely and permanently drown in his own documented lies. The legal chamber was freezing, smelling heavily of sharp lemon polish and the faint ozone of running copy machines. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, soundproofed oak doors swung open. Grant entered the deposition room wearing an immaculately tailored charcoal suit, projecting the exact same effortless, polished confidence that had initially drawn me to him all those months ago. He took his designated seat across the massive mahogany table, adjusting his silk cuffs. He offered a perfectly practiced, tightly controlled smile that suggested we were all just participating in a tragic, emotionally charged misunderstanding. He genuinely believed his silver tongue and his unparalleled ability to manipulate human emotion would easily navigate him out of this minor corporate hurdle. The sworn deposition commenced with the lead interrogator, Ada Keene, establishing the baseline narrative. Under the binding weight of a legal oath, Grant confidently repeated his heavily fabricated timeline. He smoothly testified that he possessed absolutely no prior knowledge of the internal technical mechanics or the severe maintenance issues plaguing the Halcyon Lofts project. He swore on the public, documented record that his crisis management firm was merely brought in to assist with general media relations several hours after the tragic structural failure had already occurred. When Ada gently pressed him about his glaring absence at the memorial service, he immediately deployed his favorite defensive weapon. He leaned slightly into the microphone, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow, and claimed that a severe panic attack triggered by generalized anxiety had kept him physically confined to his apartment on the day of the funeral. Ada did not raise her voice. She did not display a single ounce of theatrical courtroom anger. She simply opened the first heavy black binder resting on her desk. She smoothly slid a certified copy of the Vesper Lane service contract across the polished wood, explicitly highlighting the commencement date stamped a full 6 months prior to the accident. Grant's practiced smile twitched violently, but he remained silent. Next, Ada presented the handwritten attendance manifest from the emergency executive meeting. She politely asked him to visually identify his own signature, which was clearly written on the line dated just 24 hours before the steel cables snapped. The air in the room grew noticeably thinner. Grant nervously adjusted his tie, his smooth demeanor fracturing slightly as he stammered out a weak, convoluted clarification, claiming he had attended the meeting merely as a passive, silent observer to standard corporate procedures. Then, Ada dropped the exact email he had foolishly sent me just days prior, the frantic message where he explicitly confessed his terror of being recognized by the site foreman. She read his own desperate words aloud, permanently entering his cowardly admission into the official court transcript. The fragile anxiety defense instantly evaporated into dust. Panicking, Grant aggressively pivoted his strategy. He raised his hands defensively, insisting that while he may have been present on the site earlier than initially stated, he absolutely never participated in constructing a narrative designed to falsely blame the site supervisor. He claimed his role was strictly to protect the corporate brand from generic liability, not to actively attack an individual employee. Ada smoothly extracted the time-stamped press release draft from her second binder. She pointed directly to the digital tracking metadata, providing absolute proof that Grant himself had manually typed the exact phrases highlighting personal negligence. She followed this devastating blow immediately with the internal corporate email chain where he explicitly recommended emphasizing my brother's alleged impulsive judgment to distract the media from the severely rusted mechanical components. The sheer volume of hard, undeniable digital data was suffocating him. Sitting exactly 2 chairs down from Grant, a senior Blackwell Meridian executive began to visibly sweat. Realizing the corporate ship was rapidly sinking and absolutely desperate to save his own massive financial pension, the executive abruptly broke ranks. He leaned forward into his microphone and frantically shifted the entirety of the blame onto Grant. The executive blurted out that the crisis manager was the one who had explicitly told the board of directors that the grieving family would be infinitely less reactive if they were properly guided by the right public narrative. The ultimate decapitating blow arrived when Ada connected her secure laptop to the room's central audio system. The heavy, gravelly voice of my brother suddenly filled the sterile legal chamber. The audio recording of Nolan explicitly warning that Grant Holloway was actively paving a smooth road for a massive lie echoed loudly against the glass walls. Immediately following the recording, Ada formally submitted the original, unedited digital maintenance logs alongside Tessa's sworn legal affidavit regarding the aggressively ignored hydraulic warnings. All of Grant's masterful tools, his pristine vocabulary, his impeccable politeness, his unparalleled ability to casually spin reality, instantly and completely collapsed. He sat entirely frozen in his heavy leather chair, a hollow, utterly destroyed shell of a man. He was brutally and permanently pinned down by the relentless weight of timestamps, recovered server documents, and irrefutable witness testimony. The ensuing legal fallout was absolute and totally uncompromising. Terrified of a catastrophic public jury trial that would inevitably ruin their stock prices, Blackwell Meridian immediately capitulated. They agreed to a massive, fully public settlement that completely bypassed any confidential non-disclosure agreements. They were legally forced to issue a sweeping, front-page public retraction across multiple major news outlets, completely clearing my brother's name of any operational wrongdoing. Alongside the mandatory financial restitution paid directly to my family, the developers were legally bound to fully fund a permanent, independent construction safety foundation explicitly named in Nolan's honor. As for Grant, Vesper Lane Strategies officially terminated his employment the very next morning to protect their remaining client roster. His professional reputation was entirely obliterated. He became an absolute pariah within the elite public relations industry, permanently transforming into a man who could never step within 100 miles of a corporate crisis without his own disastrously documented cover-up instantly making the headline news. He lost his career, his status, and the seamless illusion of his perfect life. On a fiercely cold, incredibly clear Sunday morning, I drove out to the quiet suburban cemetery entirely alone. I walked across the damp grass and knelt beside the newly carved granite headstone. I gently placed a bound, physical copy of the final judicial settlement directly onto the dark earth. Taking my cell phone from my heavy winter coat pocket, I navigated to my digital archives. Without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering sorrow, I permanently deleted every single text message, every shared photograph, and every lingering digital trace of Grant Holloway from my existence. However, I carefully preserved the old, saved voicemails from my brother, making sure his voice would always remain safe on my device. I stood up, the freezing wind whipping against my dark clothing. I realized in that quiet, peaceful moment that my victory was never truly about extracting petty, vindictive revenge against a cowardly ex-boyfriend. I fought this brutal, agonizing war for one single, undeniable reason. My brother was finally resting in absolute peace, completely and forever free from the heavy, suffocating weight of their manufactured lie. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are tuning in from by dropping a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.